At the plane crash site, one lone survivor sat with his back against a tree, chewing on a bone. As he tossed the bone onto a huge pile of bones, he noticed the rescue team. "Thank heavens," he cried out in relief, "I am saved." The rescue team did not move as they were in shock, seeing the pile of human bones beside the lone survivor. Obviously, he had eaten his comrades. The survivor saw the horror in their faces and hung his own head in shame. "You can't judge me for this," he insisted. "I had to survive. Is it so wrong to want to live?" The leader of the rescue team stepped forward, shaking his head in disbelief. "I won't judge you for doing what was necessary to survive, but good heavens, man, your plane only went down yesterday." I know that's just bad, isn't it? "Is it so wrong to want to live?" he asked. No, it's not. I don't think there's any doubt that we here at St. John United Church of Christ are in survival mode. We're doing our best to keep this ship from sinking, this plane from crashing, are we not? We're not at the point where we have to metaphorically eat one another's bones, but perhaps for the first time in St. John's history, we are having to make decisions that will ensure our long-term survival. Survival is never a guarantee, even for a congregation that is 160 years old. Remember Carl Sagan, the popular scientist. In observing our world and universe, he said, "Extinction is the rule, survival is the exception." In other words, it would be normal for us to become extinct at some point in our history. The question is, can we become the exception to that rule? In the face of very long odds, can we survive another 160 years? According to some scientists, we humans, like all living creatures, have a will to live, an instinct to survive on an individual level. We'll do whatever it takes to stay alive, right? According to the psychologist Abraham Maslow, our most basic needs are related to survival. Think about it. Air, these are our most basic needs. Food, shelter, drink, warmth, sex for reproductive purposes, sleep, protection from the elements of nature, security, order, law, stability, and freedom from fear. Survival, he says, is the key to everything else. It undergirds everything else we are about. Without survival, everything else is moot. It's for this reason that last week, the President and General Minister of the United Church of Christ, John Dorhauer, speaking in conjunction with the Pope's visit to America, said, "I believe climate change is the most pressing moral issue of our time." Well, he and the Pope share the same view, which is that without a sustainable planet, nothing else matters. Without a climate that sustains life, all other issues are moot points, because it's all about survival. Now, last week I noted how the Bible is a series of stories and teachings about resistance and defiance, and I think we could make a similar claim about survival. Underneath and within many of the stories in the Bible is this instinct to survive, which is hardwired into our brains. Even when someone willingly gives up their life, like Jesus, they do so against their natural drive to stay alive. Do you remember that story of Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane? He is in total distress because he knows his end is near. And so he prays, Abba, Father, for you all things are possible. Remove this cup of death from me. Yet, not what I want, but what you want. He is fighting against his will to live. And earlier he had offered a precursor of what was to come when he tells his disciples, for those who want to save their life, that is, those who have an instinct to live, he says they will lose it, or they should lose it. And those who lose their life for my sake and for the sake of the gospel will save it. This is Jesus' way of saying that there are things that are more important than physical survival. And it seems like he's echoing the ancient Greek philosopher Aristotle at this point. Aristotle once said, "The ultimate value of life depends upon awareness and the power of contemplation rather than upon mere survival." So I think it's always good to ask ourselves, what is more important to us than even survival? What do we value more than survival? I think many of us would say quality of life, that our quality of life is more important than surviving. And here's where we begin to climb up Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Remember, we started earlier with those things related to survival. That's the baseline, that's minimal. But beyond that, he says our needs include relationships of all kinds, achievements, a sense of self-worth, growth, fulfillment, things like that. In other words, there's more to life than just breathing the air, eating, and sleeping. Still, it all begins with survival. And the two readings we heard today from Scripture both speak to the human need to survive and the willingness to do whatever it takes to survive. Most famously is the example of Queen Esther. Now, I told you I'd tell you a little about the story. I read it, part of it to you. Here's the backdrop. Esther was a queen in the court of the Persian king Ahasuerus. And the historians say that this really is Xerxes the First. Well, to make a long story short, the king became convinced, under the influence of a man named Haman, that the Jews in his kingdom were up to no good, that they were bad. And so the king agreed, well, if that's true, then we need to get rid of them. So he agreed to have them exterminated. Before that happened, however, Esther, who had really not been in favor with the king at that point, but she ingratiated herself to him. And so then she revealed to her king that she was in fact Jewish. He did not know that. Hey, I'm Jewish, she says. So in a twist of fate, the man who was trying to persuade the king to exterminate the Jews, Haman, was executed instead of Mordecai, who was the leader of the Jews. So Esther played a crucial role in saving her people, the Jews, from genocide. Even today, Persian Jews are known as Esther's children. And the Jews have established an annual feast, the Feast of Purim, in memory of their survival in ancient Persia. It doesn't take a stretch of the imagination to understand how important this story is in a post-Holocaust world. Now, our second reading is also reflective of the Jewish concern for survival. Psalm 124 was likely written in the era after Babylonian conquest and exile, somewhere in the 6th century BC. This is a time that almost led to Jewish extinction as well. Unlike the story of Esther, however, the writer imagines God as being the one who helps them to survive. Because in the book of Esther, as some of you may know, God is never mentioned. But in Psalm 124, God takes center stage as the one who helps them survive. So the psalmist wrote, "If it had not been the Lord who was on our side when our enemies attacked us, then they would have swallowed us up alive." For some reason, the movie Jaws comes to mind here. And he goes on to write about how their enemies would have destroyed them like a raging flood, sweeping away all living creatures in its path. The next image, here you see the psalmist is using a lot of colorful images. He's very poetic. The next image he uses is that of a bird caught up in a snare, ready to be devoured as prey. That would be a very helpless feeling, right? To feel trapped with no way to escape. But the psalmist imagines the snare breaking. And not just serendipitously, God is the one who keeps their enemies from swallowing them up. Much like the stranded man at the fictional crash site who eats all of his dead companions. God stops that from happening. God is the one who calms the torrential flood waters, much like the waters of chaos were calmed at the beginning of creation. God is the one who breaks the bird snare. As the psalmist concludes, our help is in the name of the Lord who made heaven and earth. And so the implication is that our best chance for survival is the one who gave us life in the first place. Now the question for us, St. John United Church of Christ, is this: can we imagine God as our helper as we seek to survive the traps and snares that have been set for us? This may have reminded you, by the way, of the third stanza of the very popular hymn, Amazing Grace. He says, "Through many dangers, toils, and snares I have already come. 'Tis grace that brought me safe thus far, and grace will lead me home." So even this very popular hymn is about survival, right? Survival of the soul, but survival nonetheless. So what does it take for a community like ours to continue into the future? Today is American Indian Ministry Sunday on our calendar. Like the Jews, Esther's children, American Indians in the United States have experienced the threat of extinction repeatedly. In spite of that, did you know that there are today 562 Native American tribes in the United States? There are over 3 million people who belong to these tribes, and many other people like myself who can trace part of their heritage back to one or more of these tribes. The will to live is strong in the Native American world. I think the same could be said about the mainline Protestant tradition, which includes us. I know that you're probably sick and tired of hearing about the sharp decline in our membership since the 1960s. There have been many books written for the purpose of making sure that we mainliners survive into the future. And they give us all kinds of advice about how to bring people into our churches and keep them there. The problem is most of the advice doesn't work very well. But should mere survival be our top concern? I mean, this may sound like I'm waving the white flag to surrender, but maybe we should be concerned about other things, about things other than survival. There's a colleague of mine in Louisville, Kentucky. His name is Derek Penwell, and he recently published a book about this very problem. We looked at it in Sunday school this morning. The book is titled "The Mainliner's Survival Guide to the Post-Denominational World." And what he means by post-denominational is that we are living in a time and place where people are becoming less and less loyal to the old denominations. People seldom care what's on the sign in the front yard of the church. Instead, they care about who is or what is on the inside of the church. People care more about a particular community or congregation rather than such things as denominational heritage, polity, or even doctrine. With that said, how can the mainline tradition survive in a world where people care very little about any particular tradition? Derek's answer is not complicated, and yet it is very provocative. He says, we must, in order to survive, we must live out the gospel's radical nature with reckless abandon. Listen to that again. We must live out the gospel's radical nature with reckless abandon. Explanation: worry less about survival of the church and aim more toward living like Jesus. Great. But what does that mean, right? You remember the disco music artist Gloria Gaynor? I wasn't a big disco fan, right? But I do remember this song, and it's called I Will Survive, #1 hit back in 1979. She wasn't talking about mainline Protestant Christianity when she produced that song, and yet the lyrics of this song could serve as our mission statement. It says, I will survive long as I know how to love. I will survive long as I know how to love. I think that'd be a great mission statement. St. John, our long-term survival may be in jeopardy, just like every other mainline Protestant congregation in the United States of America. Fortunately, we are not to the point where we have to metaphorically eat one another up. We are not close to being on the endangered species list. We're not facing genocide. There may be a few snares out there to trap us, and yet most of the snares are our own doing. Sometimes we are our own worst enemy. So there's really only one solution to the possibility that our survival is not long-term, and that is to go out there and love with reckless abandon. If we don't survive, we don't survive. But at least everyone will know that we were here. Let us pray.